Funding for this program was provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting. Charles Campbell grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, to parents who had both served in the armed forces. Both he and his older brother joined the military, influenced by their parents' dedication to the service and their devotion to God and country. In doing so, they joined the long tradition in the Campbell family, whose military service goes back generations. Charles entered the ROTC at Louisiana State University, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in history in 1970. Campbell served in Vietnam as a Special Forces commander.
Charles spent his entire career with, so to speak, mud on his boots. He spent his time in the field in various different commands, not so much in Washington. So he's a soldier's soldier.
His nickname, Hondo, was evidence to his strength of personality and character.
I really gained an appreciation for Uncle Hondo's service when I started meeting folks in the Army that had served under him. It was obvious from talking with them that he really impacted a lot of lives, and his soldiers were proud to have served under him.
I think that what drives Charlie Campbell was probably the time that he spent with his soldiers. His ability to lead soldiers and the way they reacted to that, I think are very special to him.
In an Army career that began in the jungles of Vietnam, Campbell went on to serve as Chief of Staff in 6 locations throughout the world. The only 4-star general in the Army who served in combat in Vietnam, General Campbell's last command placed him at the head of the Army's largest organization, Forces Command.
In his last position, he was head of FORSCOM, which is basically the head of the entire United States Army, U.S.
I think the fact that he's risen to the grade of 4-star general, having worked out in the field all of that time, that's very unusual. That's very unusual. And it says a lot about how competent Charles Campbell is.
After an Army career spanning 40 years, with military awards including the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and a Bronze Star, General Campbell retired.
Hondo, you and Diane can be proud to know that in your service to your Army and to your nation, you have lived up to the high standards that you set for the men and women that you lead. And it doesn't get any better than that. Good luck to you, and Godspeed.
He's returned to his hometown of Shreveport, where he and his wife Diane can enjoy being close to family, and where he now has the opportunity to enjoy personal interests.
He's one of these people that is very grounded in his roots and where he came from and who he is. I think he realizes that it was that upbringing, those places and those people that made him the man that he is. And I think that he wanted to come back to Shreveport and contribute to that community and to Louisiana, and we're looking forward to that.
Hello, welcome to Louisiana Legends. I'm Beth Courtney. It's my pleasure and privilege to visit with a proven leader and decorated military general today. He was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, and now serves as commander of the U.S. Army Forces Command, which is responsible for the training and readiness of some 750,000 soldiers. This is the Army's largest command. General Charles Campbell. Well, welcome home, General Campbell.
Delighted to be here.
I was looking back at your resume, and it says that you entered LSU in 1966. Did you ever think you'd be sitting here now? What did you think you were going to be doing when you started?
Well, 1966, it wasn't clear in my mind what I would be doing. But of course, it was very different. You may recall in that era, every able-bodied male served in the Corps of Cadets, so I joined the Corps of Cadets that was probably 7,000 strong.
But did you have to shave your head? They've stopped that.
I didn't have to shave my head, but my head had to be shaved.
I see. Okay, that's right.
Indeed, you recall those protocols, the shaved head and the beanie and the pajamas the first LSU football night. Yeah. Those are not the most memorable occasions I have of my years at LSU, but they are memories.
You majored in history.
I did.
Has that proven to be a good major for you?
It's been very useful.
And why is that?
And I think particularly in these days where we find ourselves involved in so many complex circumstances, that anyone that is broadly educated, liberally educated, educated in the humanities, I think that education gives them perspective and scope and framework and context, and it's tremendously useful.
We're talking about your favorite professors, and you have to tell us who you remember at LSU.
Well, my most memorable professor was T. Harry Williams, who, of course, was a Pulitzer Prize winner for his definitive work on Huey P. Long. But he, like so many other professors at LSU, created an excitement about learning, and he derived great joy about the progress that his students made, and I think that he would be joyful that his students have gone on to contribute meaningfully and productively to their communities and to their nation.
Well, General Campbell, I remember his Civil War and Reconstruction classes were so interesting that we brought dates. I mean, do you remember them being just packed? Weren't they fabulous?
Yeah, they were. In fact, I do recall the last lecture on the Civil War, and he very powerfully describes the furling of the bars and stars for the last time. And, of course, that signified a seminal point in the history of the South and the history of this great state.
So you're at LSU, and then you go into the Army, right? And you think you're just going to do it for a short period. When did you change your mind and think it might be for a career?
I went into the Army, was assigned to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and in a matter of weeks determined that this is something that I wanted to pursue. And as events have unfolded, I've apparently had a little aptitude for it. And,
apparently.
And it's been a wonderful journey, a great ride, and I've been blessed.
Around the same time, certainly Vietnam was hot at that point, and you went to Vietnam.
I did. I actually volunteered to stay in the Army for a third year under the proviso that I be sent to Vietnam. And I thought it was important that a nation at war, that Americans have an obligation to serve their nation. That was something that had been inculcated in me as a child, and so I had that sense of duty. Mm-hmm. And despite the turmoil and the divisiveness and the polarity that war generated, particularly at that point, I thought it was important to do the difficult and dangerous work of a free society, and I chose to go to Vietnam. And in Vietnam, I actually commanded a Special Forces 8 detachment, and was there for almost a year and a half. And
you said this was inculcated in you. Did your family? Do you have a tradition of military service in your family, or?
I do.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm the son of a Army physician and an Army nurse that both served in World War II. They separated after the war, as did that generation. My older brother is a decorated veteran who served with the 101st Airborne in Vietnam as a rifle platoon leader. My uncles both served as Army Corps aviators.
That's right.
In World War II. One of them served subsequently in the Korean War as an aviator in Vietnam.
You know, Shreveport has a big tradition of that, don't they?
Well, I think it's a tradition that's typical throughout the South generally. It's certainly typical of this great state, and it's a very fundamental part of the storied history of our great state university.
So that's interesting. So you did have this tradition of doing things, and as a young child, I guess it was very clear. I remember the world being very black and white growing up. This is right, this is wrong, this is what you should do as your duty. Is that the way you felt?
Well, I think there were simpler times, but in a lot of respects, there were some enduring truths that are as applicable today as they were then, and it has to do with love of country, and it has to do with obligations that Americans have to try to leave this world a better place than what they found it. And that's been our history, frankly. You know, we're a unique nation in that regard. We're like unlike any nation that's ever existed.
Coming out of Vietnam, what were your next commands? Where did you, I mean, you were on staff, I'm sure. Yeah, but what did you
Actually,
do next?
I was in Special Forces, and I returned to my parent branch, which was Armor. And I was assigned to a tank battalion at Fort Hood, Texas. And then that began a long number of years in the Armor community. So I returned to Fort Hood, Texas, commanded at the company level, and then subsequently benefited from the Army's educational system.
Advanced.
Went through advanced schooling at the infantry school at Fort Benning. And then subsequently had my first of 4 assignments in Europe, followed by Commanding General Staff College.
Right. Well, you ended up, so you were in Europe and Germany, and where else?
Well, I've been in Europe for 4 tours over the course of a 37-year career, for probably close to 12 or 13 years. And it was a marvelous assignment. And it was, the first years there were when we were standing steadfastly against the Soviet juggernaut. And because we stood as a nation for more than 40 years with 250,000 of our noble young, the Soviet Union collapsed of its own weight in the inherent flaws of its ideology and of its system.
It's just astounding. I look back over your career, things that have happened with the Cold War really ending, the Berlin Wall coming down, the collapse of the Soviet system. It's amazing things like that have happened. I know over my father's course of his career, he went from open cockpits to landing a man on the moon. It does feel sometimes like history is rushing past, doesn't it?
Well, I would tell you, and I mentioned this to these young commissionees, that if I had to define the prominent feature of the years that I have served in our Army's in our nation's uniformed service, I would say it was the feature of change. And I didn't believe in 1966 that I would be a witness, much less a participant, to the magnitude of change that occurred. But in our lifetimes, we've seen the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the dismantling of the Warsaw Pact. We've seen advances in technologies that weren't conceivable. So change confronts us in every dimension of our lives. And these young men and women who were commissioned today are going to have to be able to not just react to change, but shape it in constructive, enduring ways. And that's their challenge.
It seems like they have to be awfully well educated in technology, though, too. Gosh, technology is changing so rapidly. You can't. You have to have a very well educated military force now. Would be my sense of this. Is this true? Do you finding that's more?
We learned that a number of years ago. We learned it really when we came out of the Vietnam conflict, which we fought with a conscripted force.
Right.
And our nation made a determination that we would create an all-volunteer force. And when we made that determination, we understood that the force would have to be smaller, and it would have to be technology-enabled. And when we made a determination that it had to be technology-enabled, we had to commit ourselves to recruiting into our armed forces brighter people.
Right.
And so that commitment, which was made really in the late 70s, was wedded to a commitment to write a new doctrine and then to procure the capabilities that allowed us to execute that doctrine. And then we made a massive investment in our educational system, both officer and non-commissioned officer. And all those dynamics kind of came into convergence, if you will, about the time that we prosecuted the first war in Iraq.
Right.
And we fielded the world's most capable Army and the world's most dominant Air Force, and we fashioned a military success in hours
A number of commanders in that first Gulf War were, certainly quoted as saying, we did not want Vietnam to happen again. We wanted to make sure that was the case, that we had overwhelming dominant force. And that was the hallmark of that, I suppose, and played out like that.
Well, we accomplished in that conflict the objectives that we sought out to accomplish.
Right.
And in some respect, those were limited objectives. It was to restore the territorial integrity of Kuwait. And as you may recall, we withdrew from Iraq. And but the specific military conditions on the ground that were achieved related specifically to the political outcomes that were sought. But they weren't expansive outcomes. They were fairly well-defined outcomes, and they were all achievable in the context of the nation's commitment at that point.
So here we are really with a well-educated, formidable, strong military force, and then the whole nature of what the enemy we're looking at changes. It's one thing to be fighting a country, it's an organized kind of strategic, and another to be random terrorists where some person you don't even know could be your enemy. I mean, doesn't it change, and how does the military adapt to that? Because at that point, it's not so much a military problem as intelligence and a variety of other things.
Well, first, I take exception with your characterization about the threat being random terrorist.
Okay, well.
It manifests itself in terrorism that has
spoken as a person who has trouble getting on airplanes. That's
the quality of randomness. But in fact, there's nothing random about Al-Qaeda.
Right.
And there's nothing that is fleeting about the nature of that threat to our sovereignty and to our way of life. The fact of the matter is we are confronting, yet again in our history, a murderous ideology. And this ideology seeks to destroy Western liberalized democracies. It seeks totalitarian aims. It has territorial ambitions. And it seeks to impose oppressive regimes that deny to people fundamental rights that we in our nation have enjoyed for centuries.
Well, I certainly see something that's changed. Speaking of change again, though, and that is that when some soldiers came back from Vietnam, and of course I was a child in a military family too, they had a very unfortunate experience. It seems like soldiers coming back now from Iraq, no matter what the political climate, everyone wants to say, we want to support our soldiers. Do you feel that is
No,
the
absolutely.
case?
And thankfully, we've learned our lesson from Vietnam. In Vietnam, we made the mistake commonly to hold the soldier, the sailor, the airman, Marine accountable for the policy that was formulated by the elected civilian leadership of the nation. And so because there was such a widespread unhappiness with the policy, it was, quite frankly, kind of dysfunctionally directed to soldiers who were simply doing what the nation asked them to do. Now we have people who can make the differentiation between the soldier, the sailor, and the airman Marine, the noble young of our nation, who answer our nation's call and do our nation's bidding, from those that formulate the policies that they may or may not agree with.
I do see another change, and see if you reflect on this too as well. It seems that the National Guard is called up much more than it did earlier in your career, I guess, and it seems like they're being activated to be, full-time soldiers a lot more. This is a change, or?
Yeah, this is a huge change. And we are kind of confronting the challenges that grow out of converting what was designed to be a strategic reserve to a force that is being employed operationally. When we built, I use it in a collective sense, the National Guard and the reserves, we envisioned that they would be mobilized sequentially under a condition of full mobilization, that they would go to mobilization sites, be equipped and trained, and then they would be employed sequentially to complement the previous employment of the active component structure. They would fight until the war was concluded successfully, then they would be demobilized and returned to their communities. But that's not how we have used the reserve component, because we've asked them repeatedly, first involuntarily and then subsequently voluntarily, to mobilize and to complement our active component structures. And that grows out of a condition, quite frankly, of an active component army that is too small for the requirements that are being generated by the combatant commanders.
Well, we certainly are focusing on you as a legend today. Events are unfolding quickly every day. I'm sure there's pressure on us to, no one wants to extend anything any longer than it has to be in the Middle East, but the average person, no matter where we are at this moment, realizes the Middle East is going to be a difficult tinderbox for a long time to come, right?
It's been a difficult tinderbox.
History.
For, in your historical recollection, for 4,000 years.
Yeah, well, as you spoke to young people today, did you give them some sense of you too can do this? You know, you're from Shreveport, Louisiana. We in Louisiana sometimes it feels that we have a inferiority complex. I mean, after the storms and everything, we had to keep saying, yes, we're smart, good people. Yes, we combat difficulties. I mean, any message for those out there about what it is to be a Louisianian?
Well, I think you can take great pride in this state. I take great pride in this state. I've always derived a great sense of joy from having been shaped by my experience growing up and being educated here. Many of my family and my friends still reside in this great state. It is a state that's unique for all the reasons that you no doubt have detailed in previous exposés. It has a wonderful joie de vivre. Louisianans take great joy in relishing life and living life fully and abundantly and richly. They value relationships. They value that which is important to value in life, which is family and friends and community and God. And these are all descriptors of Louisianans, and it's a special place. And I believe that Louisianans are very proud of this nation and very proud of this state and very proud of this state's contributions to this great nation.
When you saw the storms come, when you saw Katrina and Rita, did you think, oh, I want to go down and help? Were you did you just think, gosh, I want to?
I actually was in Korea. I was the commanding general of 8th Army, served there for 4 years of this last tour. And I remember it very, very vividly. And quite frankly, it tore my heart out. It was such wanton devastation. And I'm not sure that the history has been written, but there were many heroic things done by many people under conditions that were unimaginable. I mean, this was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. And even the best laid plans of mice and men go astray, and in this particular case, just the sheer magnitude of the destruction and the devastation was such that it's difficult to respond in ways that are timely and in ways that
So did you watch it unfold on satellite, on CNN? It was everywhere. Right?
It was covered. It was amazing. It was covered with great interest all around the world. And I might add that, and I've spent 8 years in Korea over the course of a lifetime. Many Koreans who remain indebted to our great nation for what we did more than 50 years ago when we sent our noble young to a place we didn't know to defend the land we didn't know and a people we'd never met, sent millions of dollars in support.
Well, worldwide generosity.
There was a tremendous outpouring of support.
Well, you're closer to home now. You're in Atlanta.
Atlanta.
Is that the closest you've ever been? Texas. You've been.
I was stationed at Fort Hood twice.
Yeah. So what we found growing up, being a Shreveport native, moving around the world, we had people visit us a lot in Europe from Louisiana. Do you have lots of visitors coming to see you from home state or not?
I have, and I have for many years tendered that invitation. Occasionally people would visit when I was in Europe.
But not Korea?
But, surprisingly, people aren't inclined to visit the Orient, which is a huge mistake because it's a marvelously broadening experience. And we've got tremendous allies in the Orient, that have been enduring, prominently the Koreans, but also the Japanese and the Thais and others.
Well, I have to ask you, do you know General Barrow? Have you met other Louisianians around the world?
I have. I don't know General Barrow. I know a little bit of the history. Of course, he's a former Commandant of the Marine Corps,
right,
product of South Louisiana.
Absolutely.
I had an occasion just about a month ago to run into Lieutenant General Tom Rame.
Oh, yes.
Who was inducted into the LSU Hall of Distinction in the aftermath of the First Gulf War. He commanded the 1st Infantry Division. He is living with his wife from LeConte up in Washington, D.C. It was good to see him. I'd served with him many, many years ago. And there are a number of general officers that have served, that have come from Louisiana, if not from LSU, but other universities have.
Well, we hope when you retire, are you coming home, maybe?
It's well within the pale. I mean, I'm inclined to return to North Louisiana. I've got 2 brothers there, a lattice work of old friends, and so my natural predisposition is to return to Louisiana. I look forward to it.
Well, we congratulate you on all your success, and thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org. Funding for this program was provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.